Do you know why a lot of language learners never get past the beginner or intermediate level? Most of you will never get to an advanced level and you will never get fluent. And I'm going to show you why and how to fix it. And you're probably thinking that I'm going to say that's because you only do comprehensible input and you don't practice your speaking skills. And that's also true. And I'll talk about that later, maybe at the end of the video. But I want to talk about something else, something that's really, really important, even for comprehension, not only for speaking. I'm talking about vocabulary size. The difference between someone who is at a B2 or C1 level and someone who is A1, A2 level is vocabulary size. The main difference. You need to know a lot of words. And the problem these days is that you all have been told that you can learn vocabulary by immersion and with comprehensible input. That's the most efficient way. Actually, they tell you that is the only way to learn vocabulary. So the only and the best solution, the best and probably the only solution you've been told is that you should spend thousands of hours watching YouTube videos for beginners in the language, and eventually, in 5 or 10 years, you will get to an advanced level. You will not, but um, let me explain why and how to solve it. All right. The problem with comprehensible input is that, as the word itself, itself says, like it needs to be comprehensible. All right, and you can go both ways. You can either try to dumb it down as much as possible to make it comprehensible, so you get a weird guy in really slow and dumb videos talking to you like a kid, and you do thousands of hours of that so that you're actually doing something that's comprehensible, or you watch it with subtitles, or you watch something with subtitles that's very difficult and you will not understand much, and unless you watch the same content over and over again. What's the solution? You can and you should definitely do a lot of comprehensible input, but in the beginning, I highly recommend you learn as much vocabulary as possible deliberately. And specifically, I highly recommend you learn verbs. You should also learn language islands, but that's something else. Those are your own sentences that you need for speaking, and but that's for speaking. But when it comes to comprehension, learning verbs, and not only the most common verbs, like the most common 100 verbs, you learn them very quickly in context. This is a list of the most common 2,000 verbs in Russian, and like I want this, we'll go there, we eat in this, like that kind of stuff. You learn it very quickly. But in order to understand more interesting content, podcasts, the news, whatever, radio, books, for that, you'll need this kind of this kind of vocabulary and this kind of verbs. We don't use this kind of verbs in conversation normally, unless you're really articulate and eloquent and all that. But like preserve, avoid. Okay, some people do use them, but for the most part, in simple conversation in a foreign language, you will not use them. But you will hear them a lot if you're listening to native speakers, especially native speakers who are educated. So you need to know them in order to understand. All right, the amount of words you need to know to understand actually interesting content or authentic content, it's much bigger than the amount of vocabulary you need to communicate effectively. If you want to sound eloquent, eventually fluent, not only fluent but proficient in the language, you will need to know all that vocab actively as well. But for comprehension and for being able to understand interesting content, you will need a lot of this vocab. So you need vocab in general, but especially verbs. and these kind of verbs. And that's why I go with the most common 500-ish first, and then 2000. In context, example sentences, and you drill these verbs over and over until you know them. And just by doing this, just by learning most common, whatever many verbs you need to know, like 1,000 to 2,000 verbs, your comprehension of, again, if you know pronunciation, right? If you really struggle with the pronunciation of the language, that's a different story. But if you learn not just the most common verbs, but pretty much all the verbs that exist in normal language, outside really outdated stuff and really archaic verbs and all that. And maybe you should learn those as well if you're watching historical shows. But if you learn a list of pretty much all the verbs in the language that are in use these days, you will understand. Not gonna say everything, but pretty much everything when you're listening. If you learn them with example sentences, just list. If you learn a list of words with no context, obviously it's going to be much harder. But if you learn the verbs with different conjugations as well, like solving a problem, you're solving. He was solving. It's different in Russian. Я решаю, ты решаешь, он решал, мы будем решать. Yeah, different endings. You learn that with example sentences, enough of them, enough variety of example sentences of the verbs, and you learn all the conjugations and all of that. So my advice would be to go for a list of the most common verbs, and then to all verbs from there, and you should use mnemonics. But if you don't use mnemonics, anyway, if you use mnemonics or not, you should read and listen to this over and over and over again until you understand each and every sentence easily when you're listening to the list. 2,000 sentences is less than 2 hours of audio. You can listen to this 20 or 30 times and read it like 4 or 5 times, and you'll understand pretty much everything in the language, right? So that's the plan. If you want to get to a decent level of comprehension fast, focus on the verbs. And I said earlier that I talk about speaking as well. Of course, if you want to go from a beginner level to actually fluent, you need to do a lot of speaking practice as well. And for comprehension, learning the verbs will help, but this alone will not help your speaking. When it comes to speaking, you should do a lot of shadowing, repeat everything aloud as much as you can when you're listening, and learn your language islands. Write down everything you want to be able to say, and then some more. Right? Speak to yourself, record it, everything you weren't able to say, write it later, write it down later, and then add it to the language islands and drill those sentences as well. Drill more and more sentences for every single interaction, situation, conversation topic until you're able to say absolutely everything you want to be able to say. That's how you develop fluency. All right. And that's it for today.